Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Truckers Podcast, FYI. I'm your host, Doug from Ontario, Canada. Welcome to the show. It is Saturday at 8:34 a.m. on the 28th of September. Hope everybody's having a good start to the weekend. I hope everybody had a good week. Um, I have been really busy um, the last couple of weeks. Um, Things at work have really picked up, working um, long hours as usual. Um, Trying to get out here and do a show is has become painstakingly hard to do. Um, like I've said from time to time, I can't do a show when fatigue is setting in. Um, Loss of concentration when that happens. But anyways, um, got up bright and early this morning in order to do this show. Um, so for many of us, or probably for a lot of us, um, over the past centuries, even growing up, um, we never heard of or even learned about the residential school system here in Canada. Monday, September 30th is Truth and Reconciliation Day across Canada. The federal government has made it a statutory holiday, but not everybody participates in that stat holiday. But we have a lot of things going on this weekend. Um, in the indigenous communities will bring their arts and their crafts and their heritage to light here in the city and in around the country, and we are all welcome to go and participate and join them. You can't say these things what the first Prime Minister of Canada said back in 1883. And it was the speech to the House of Commons. The first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, explained, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the Department of Indian Children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be put them in essential training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. You cannot get away with that today. Residential school system is, like I said, we didn't learn about it in school. Never really even heard about it. My first hearing about it would be in the mid 90s. when the prime minister then was apologizing to the indigenous communities across Canada for the role that the government played in the residential school system. The term residential schools refers to an extensive school system set up by the Canadian government and administered by churches that had the normal objective of educating Indigenous children, but also the more damaging and equality explicit objectives of indoctrinating them into the Euro-Canadian and Christian ways of living and assimilated them into the mainstream white Canadian society. The residential school system officially operated from the 1800s into the closing decades of the 21st century, which is the last one closed in 1996. The system forcibly separated children from their families for an extended period of time and forbade them to acknowledge the Indigenous heritage and culture or to speak their own languages. Children were severely punished if these, among others, strict rules were broken. Former students of the residential school system have spoken of the horrendous abuse of the hands of the residential school staff: physical, sexual, emotional, psychological. Residential schools provided Indigenous students with inappropriate education, often only up to lower grades that focus mainly on prayer and manual labor and agriculture, light industry such as woodworking, and domestic work such as laundry, working, and sewing. The residential schools systematically undermined Indigenous First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit cultures across Canada and disrupted families for generations, serving the ties through which Indigenous cultures is taught and sustained, and contributing to a general loss of language and culture. Because they were removed from their families, many students grew up without experience and nurturing family life and without the knowledge and skills to raise their own families. The devastating effects of the residential schools are far-reaching and continue to have a significant impact on the Indigenous communities right into the 21st century. The residential school system is widely considered a form of genocide because of the purposeful attempt from the government and church to eradicate all aspects of Indigenous cultures and life worlds, because they thought they could just make them civilized because they thought they weren't civilized, and being as civilized as the white man. From the 1990s onward, the government and the churches involved, Anglican, Presbyterian, United, and the Roman Catholic, began to acknowledge their responsibility for an education scheme that was specifically designed to kill the Indian in the child. On June 11th, 2008, the Canadian government issued a formal apology in Parliament for the damage done by the residential school system. In spite of this and other apologies, however, the effects remain. So what led up to the residential schools? And by that comment, Sir A. Macdonald addressed in the House of Commons in the mid 1800s that I read to you at the beginning of the show. The early origins of the residential schools in Canada are found in the implementations of the mission system in the 1600s. The churches and European settlers brought with them the assumption that their own civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement. They interpreted the socio-cultural differences between themselves and the indigenous peoples as proof that Canada's first inhabitants were ignorant, savage, and, like children, in need of guidance. They felt the need to civilize indigenous peoples' education, a federal responsibility, became the primary means to this end. Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald commissioned journalists and politicians Nicholas Flood Davin to study industrial schools for Indigenous children in the United States. Davin's recommendations to follow the U.S. example of aggressive civilization led to public funding for the residential school system. If anything is going to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized conditions, Davin wrote in his 1879 report on industrial school for Indians and the half-breeds. Davin's report can be read. So in the 1880s, in conjunction with other federal assimilation policies, the government began to establish residential schools across Canada. Authorities would frequently take children to schools far from their home communities, part of a strategy to alienate them from their families and familiar surroundings. In 1920, under the Indian Act, it became mandatory for every Indigenous child to attend a residential school and illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. So they couldn't go. In 1920s, of course, we have public schools, but they couldn't go. The living conditions at the schools, the purpose of the residential schools was to eliminate all aspects of the Indigenous culture. Students had their hair cut short. They were dressed in uniforms. They were often given numbers. And their days were strictly regimental by timetables. Boys and girls were kept separate. And even siblings rarely interacted, further weakening family ties. Chief Bobby Joseph of the Indian Residential School Survivor Society recalls that he had no idea how to interact with girls and never even got to know his own sister, beyond a mere wave in the dining room. In addition, students were strictly forbidden to speak their languages, even though many children knew no other, or to practice indigenous customs or traditions. Violations of these rules were severely punished. The abuse in the schools were widespread. Emotional, psychological abuse was constant. Physical abuse was metered out of punishment, and sexual abuse was also common. Survivors recalled being beaten and strapped, Some students were shackled to their beds. Some had needles shoved in their tongues for speaking their native languages. These abuse, along with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and severely inadequate food and health care, resulted in the shockingly high death toll in 1907. Government Medical Inspector P.H. Bryce reported that 24% of the previously healthy Indigenous children across Canada were dying in residential schools. This figure does not include children who died at home. They were frequently sent when critically ill. And Bryce reported that anywhere from 47% on the Piegan Reserve in Alberta to 75% from File Hills Boarding School in Saskatchewan of students discharged from residential schools died shortly after returning home. To the extent to which the Department of the Indian Affairs and church officials knew of these abuses has been debated by some. However, the Royal Commission and the Aboriginal people and John Malloy, among others, concluded the church and state officials were fully aware of the abuses and the tragedies at the schools. Some inspectors and officials at the time expressed alarm at the horrifying death rate. Yet those who spoke out and called for reform were generally met with silence and lack of support. And the Department of Indian Affairs would promise to improve the schools, but the deplorable conditions persisted. So we have to shift away from the residential school systems. Church and state officials of the 19th century believed that Indigenous societies were disappearing and that the only hopes for the Indigenous people was to convert to Christianity, do away with their cultures, and become civilized British subjects. In short, assimilate them. And by the 1950s, the same officials were doubling the viability of such projects, the devastating effects of the residential schools, and the needs and life experience of the Indigenous students were becoming more widely recognized. And the government also acknowledged that removing children from their families was severely detrimental to the health of the individuals in the communities affected. 1951, with the amendments to the Indian Act, the half-day work school system was progressively abandoned, conceding power to the provinces to apprehend children and transitioning from the school system to a child welfare system. This time is referred as to the 60 scoop because of the systematic removal of Indigenous children from their families without consent from their parents or authorities. So in 1969, the Department of the Indian Affairs took exclusive control of the system, making an end to church involvement in residential schools. And yet the schools remained underfunded and abuse continued. And many teachers and workers continued to lack proper credentials to carry out their responsibilities. And in the meantime, the government decided to phase out segregation and begin incorporating Indigenous students into public schools. All these changes saw students reaching higher levels of education. Problems persisted. Many Indigenous students struggled in their adjustment to public school and to the Eurocentric system where Indigenous knowledges were excluded, fostering discrimination by their non-Indigenous peers. Post-secondary education was strongly discouraged for Indigenous students because those who wanted to attend university would have been enfranchised. So the process to phase out the residential schools and other assimilation tactics was slow and not without reversals. The residential school system in Canada lasted officially for almost 150 years, and its impacts continue on to this day. The system closure gave way to the 60 Scoop, during which thousands of Indigenous children were abducted by social services and removed from their families. The Scoop spanned roughly the 2 decades it took to phase out the residential schools. But child apprehensions from Indigenous families continue to occur in disproportionate numbers today. In part, this is the legacy of the compromised families and communities left by the residential schools. So in 1969, residential schools in Canada began to decline in numbers. In 1970, the Department of Indian Affairs calculated 56 remaining schools, excluding the Northwest Territories. By 1980, the same institutions reported 16, and one decade later, 11 in 1996. Gordon Reserve Indian Residential Schools in Saskatchewan, the last of its kind, was closed and demolished. And by 1999, the Department of Indian Affairs registered no remaining residential schools in operation. You know, discrimination is still happening today to the Indigenous people. Racism still continues. The ongoing impacts the residential school system is viewed by much of the Canadian public as part of a distant past, disassociated from today's events in many ways. This is a misconception. The last residential school did not close its doors until 1996, and many of the leaders, teachers, parents, and grandparents of today's Indigenous communities are residential school survivors. Although residential schools have closed, their effects remain ongoing for both survivors and their descendants, who now share in the integrational effects of transmitted personal trauma and loss of language, culture, traditional teachings, and mental, spiritual well-being. According to the report of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba, several generations of the Indigenous peoples were denied the development of parenting skills, not only through the removal from communities and families, but also from this a severe lack of attention paid to the issue by school officials. In addition, children were taught that their traditional ways were inferior, including their language and cultures. The residential schools were operational through several generations of indigenous peoples, so that the process of healing from these damages will also take several generations. A process that has already begun, but has not taken, and it has not been easy, and it has not been simple. So, this historic intergenerational and collective oppression of the indigenous peoples continues to this day in the forms of land disputes, the over incarceration, lack of housing, child apprehension, systemic poverty, marginalized and violence against indigenous women, girls, and the 2S LGBTQIA peoples, and other critical issues which neither began nor ended with the residential schools. Generations of oppressive government policies attempted to strip indigenous peoples of their identities, not only through residential schools, but also through other policies, including, but not limited to, the implementation and subsequent changes to the Indian Act, the mass removal of indigenous children from their families into the child welfare system known as the 60s scoop, the legislation allowing forced sterilization of the indigenous people in certain provinces, a practice that has continued to be reported by indigenous women in Canada as recently as 2018. And currently, through the modern child welfare system, which continue to disproportionately apprehend indigenous children into foster care, and what Raven Sinclair has called the Millennium Scoop. So this sort of thing is still going on here when it comes to removing children, indigenous children, from their families and putting them into foster care, putting them into the the welfare state. Now this is 2024. So in 2019, BC ended its practice of birth alerts in child welfare cases, which allowed child welfare agencies and hospitals to flag mothers deemed high risk without their consent. A practice which targeted indigenous mothers and was found to be racist and discriminatory, and a gross violation of the rights of the child, the mother, and the community. One of the findings of the Missing and the Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report asserts that the Canadian state has used child welfare laws and agencies as a tool to oppress, displace, disrupt, and destroy Indigenous families, communities, and nations. It is a tool in the genocide of Indigenous peoples, child welfare laws, and agencies, like the residential school system, effectively aided in the removal of Indigenous children from their families and continue to aid in the genocide of Indigenous peoples. But throughout the history of the residential school system and the detrimental effects it had and still has on the Indigenous people and their communities today. And the survivors demand justice, and rightfully so. The residential schools heavily contributed to educational, social, financial, and health disparities between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada. And these impacts have been intergenerational. And despite the efforts of the residential school system and those who created and mandated it, Indigenous people largely escaped complete assimilation and continue to work to regain what was lost, while also seeking justice for years of wrongdoing, including from the Canadian government, the churches, and the individuals responsible for specific cases of abuse. And it wasn't until late 1980s that the Canadian legal system began to respond to allegations of abuse brought forward by survivors. With fewer than 50 convictions coming out of more than 38,000 claims of sexual and physical abuse submitted to the independent to the court systems. The notable cases include 1988's Mowat versus Clark, in which 8 former students of the St. George's Indian Residential School in Layton, BC, sued a priest, the government, and the Anglican Church of Canada. Both the Anglican Church and the government admitted fault and agreed to a settlement in 1995. 27 survivors from the Alberni Indian Residential School filed charges for sexual abuse against Arthur Plintwhite, also holding Canada and the United Church liable. In addition to the convicting Plint, the court held the federal government and the United Church responsible for the wrongs committed. So, being Truth and Reconciliation Day on Monday, and the calls, I believe it's the calls to action. And that's not coming up. Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action. In order to redress the legacy of the residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes the following calls to action. Child welfare. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territory and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care by monitoring and assessing neglect investigations, providing adequate resources to enable Aboriginal communities and child welfare organizations to keep Aboriginal families together where it is safe to do so, and to keep children in their culture appropriate environments, regardless of where they reside. Ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the history and the impacts of residential schools. Ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the potential for Aboriginal communities and families to provide more appropriate solutions to family healing. Requiring that all child welfare decision makers consider the impact of the residential school experience on children and their caregivers. They call upon the federal government in collaboration with the provinces and territories to prepare and publish annual reports on the number of Aboriginal children, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis who are in care compared with non-Aboriginal children, as well as the reasons for the apprehension, the total spending on the preventative and care services by child welfare agencies, and the effectiveness of the various interventions. Child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice, reconciliation, Canadian governments in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Royal Proclamation of the Covenant of Reconciliation, Settlement Agreement parties, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Equity for Aboriginal people in the legal system. National Council for Reconciliation. Professional development training for public servants. Church apologies and reconciliation. The Pope came to Canada. A couple of years back. The Catholic Church and the Pope apologized on behalf of the Catholic Church involvement in the residential school system. We haven't heard from the United Church or other Christian churches of their role in the residential school systems. Anglican Church. Education for reconciliation. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in consultation and cooperation with survivors, Aboriginal peoples, and educators to make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal peoples' historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory education requirement for kindergarten to grade 12 students. Provide the necessary funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. Provide the necessary funding to Aboriginal schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. The list goes on, ladies and gentlemen. These are the calls to action. Youth programs, museums and archives, missing children and burial information. National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Commemoration. Media and reconciliation. Sports and reconciliation. Business and reconciliation. Newcomers to Canada. $94 calls to action. How are they going to deliver this? The Government of Canada's progress in responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action. What if they implemented and most of everything that I just read out to you? Monday, September the 30th, is Truth and Reconciliation Day. Like I said at the beginning of the show, there's going to be a lot of activities going on in communities. And the people and the Indigenous people, they get to showcase their talents, get to showcase their heritage. And all sorts of activities and their culture. And it's all free to go and see what is going on. And today and like any other day and like any other decade or century, whether or not you're an indigenous, whether you're black, whether you're Chinese, Korean, Islam, racism still continues today in the 21st century. How and when, and we already know, I don't even have to say that, we already know, the implications of racism. Whatever background you come from. And you don't even have to be of color, Jewish, other nationalities, just because. Why? Because they come from afar? Somehow they're different? We are 99.999% the same. And how is that? Because we're all human beings. A couple years back when the government made September 30th, it's a federal stat holiday for Truth and Reconciliation, September 30th. I mentioned that to my employer, and I said, well, it's a federal holiday. I mean, we're federally regulated in the trucking industry. Are we going to have that day off? He knew nothing of it. I could take it off. I mean, I can't take it off now because it's too late to book the day off. But I wouldn't get paid for it. So what the company did was, we'll give you family day off in February in lieu of Truth and Reconciliation Day of September 30th. October, November, December, January, February, 5 months later. We'll give you family day off and we'll pay you in lieu of the Truth and Reconciliation Day. Family Day has nothing to do with Truth and Reconciliation Day. This is a provincial, Family Day is a provincial holiday. And not every company participates in the Family Day. It was just another holiday to kind of just to break up long weekends. That's it. That's all that is. It has nothing to do with anything. It has nothing to do with Truth and Reconciliation. A provincial holiday just to break up the winter months for a long weekend. There's lots. I mean, there's lots to read. I mean, you can search the 94 calls to action, the 94 recommendations, truth and reconciliation. You can search the residential school system. You can research the residential school systems that took place in the mid 1800s to the last one closing in 1996 here in Canada. And the atrocities that the Indigenous people of Canada went through. And the effects of the residential schools still linger today from the survivors, mentally, physically, health, discrimination, and so on. You can research all that information. Now, I don't know, I mean, are the public schools, Catholic schools, whether it's high school or grade school, universities, colleges, are they going to be teaching about the residential schools in history class? Are they doing that now? I don't know because I'm not in school. Certainly is a black eye on Canadian history. Probably two black eyes. So the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, each year, September 30th, marks the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The day honors the children who never return home and survivors of residential schools, as well as their families and communities. The public commemoration of the tragic and painful history and ongoing impacts of residential schools is a vital component of the reconciliation process. Wear orange. Both the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation Day and Orange Shirt Day take place on September the 30th. Orange Shirt Day is an Indigenous-led grassroots commemorative day intended to raise awareness of the individual, family, and community intergenerational impacts of residential schools and promote the concept of every child matters. The orange shirt is a symbol of the stripping away of the culture, freedom, and self-esteem experienced by the Indigenous children over generations. On September the 30th, we encourage all Canadians to wear orange to honor the thousands of survivors of residential schools. Commemorating the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation across the country, you will find open to public local activities and gatherings organized to commemorate the history and the legacy of the residential schools. illuminating Parliament Hill to commemorate the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation Day, Orange Shirt Day, remembering the children National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Had the Truth and Reconciliation Week. The National Center for the Truth and Reconciliation offers a free virtual education program from September 23rd to the 27th to all schools across Canada. That's what's happening. And over the weekend, leading up to Monday, I have an orange t-shirt, which I will be wearing. But enlighten yourself, educate yourself. Not, even in the United States. I mean, Canada got the idea from the United States, the Indian schools in the United States. They called them Indian schools. We called them residential schools. Do your research. Now, I didn't pick this book up the other day, but my brother actually picked this book up the other day. I'm not much of a book reader, and I should read more. I don't know why I don't read books all the time. I mean, there's lots of things out there to read about. I recommend this book to anybody. And I just, I started reading it the other day, and so the book is called When We Walk By. Forgotten Humanity, Broken Systems, and the role we can each play in ending homelessness. It's a must read. It really is. You can get it at your local bookstores. You can get it on Amazon. Homelessness. There's a stigma attached to that. I want to refer it to as the unhoused. And use that reference and hope it'll catch on, and in hopes that it'll ease up, on the stigma attached to the homeless. I rather say the unhoused. But it is a must read. And I'm going to read a little bit more of it before I go and run my errands today, because I can't put it down. And like I say, I'm not generally a book reader, but I can't put it down. So it's called When We Walk By. Kevin F. Adler and Donald W. Burns. It's a must read for anyone interested in solving the problem of the unhoused, which, by the way, is just a crisis. And we'll talk more about that on the next episode of the Truckers Podcast. FYI, I'll talk a little bit more about the book tomorrow morning as well. So enjoy your weekend. It is the weekend, finally, Saturday. Wish weekends could be longer, but unfortunately, they're not longer. But anyways, enjoy your weekend, and hopefully you can join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here on the Truckers Podcast, FYI. Like I say, too, before I go, I mean, do a little homework, do a little research, about the Truth and Reconciliation and the 94 calls to action and the history of the residential school systems here in Canada. So thank you for joining me this morning, ladies and gentlemen. And like I said, enjoy your weekend. Hopefully you can join me tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm your host, Doug, from Ontario, Canada. Take care.